Here we have a phylogenetic tree of the evolution of land plants. All land plants that we know of today look like they can be traced back to a common ancestor, which would have been a green algae. That green algae is believed to come from the phylum Charophyta. And in the beginning of this chapter, we talked about some of the characteristics that would have had to develop in order to enable life on dry land. Now we can take the land plants that we know of and they can be divided into several different categories, but one of the biggest distinctions is vascular tissue. So we have one group that's called the non-vascular plants, and then we have the vascular plants. We're going to talk first about the non-vascular plants, and then we'll move into the vascular ones. So if we first look at the non-vascular plants, these are commonly referred to as the bryophytes. Now that term bryophytes is really a generic term because this is going to include 3 different phylum. And if we look at those 3 different phylum, the first one is the Bryophyta. Now that is obviously where that name came from, but we do have 2 other phylums that fall into this. We're going to have Anthocerophyta, and then we also have Hepatophyta. We're going to talk about each one of these groups, but we're first going to focus on the bryophytes. Now, one thing to keep in mind as we go through these non-vascular plants is that all of them are going to have a dominant gametophyte generation. And this is something that is going to change a little bit later when we get into the vascular plants. But at this point, when we look at the non-vascular plants, the part that you usually see is going to be gametophyte tissue, which means it's going to be haploid tissue. If we start with a look at a typical life cycle for a plant that's in the Bryophyta, this would be a moss. So if we look at moss, typically the part that you see when you look at moss is going to be this green tissue here. So you're going to see some leafy tissue. That is the gametophyte tissue. So that's haploid cells that are going to be photosynthetic, so they're going to be nourishing the rest of the plant. And at the very top of that is where we're going to find the sporophyte tissue. The sporophyte is very small. This is going to typically be brown cells, and we're going to have this little structure here where we have what we call the seta, which is like a little stalk. And then you're going to have this part on the end, which is what's going to actually produce the spores. So that's the sporangium. So we're seeing that here. It can be called the capsule as well. So certain cells within that sporangium tissue, those are going to be diploid. So they're going to undergo meiosis, and that process then is going to produce spores. These spores are going to then germinate. And when we say that they germinate, this means that they are going to divide by mitosis. So all in here, we have mitosis taking place. So that's occurring right here. It's also occurring right here, so that those haploid cells that make up the spore are going to be able to produce more cells just like them. And when they do this, that gametophyte is going to be produced. That gametophyte is going to be a filamentous structure that eventually gives rise to the little leafy moss that we know of, and it's very thin. So we don't have a lot of cell layers there, typically just 1 or 2 cell layers, and that's because we aren't going to have those vascular transport tissues that we have in some of the more evolved land plants. So this is going to enable them to really absorb nutrients and water from their surroundings. Now, another thing that we have with regard to the gametophyte tissue is that they're going to have structures on the bottom of them, which are called rhizoids. Rhizoids are somewhat similar to roots, but they're going to be strictly for attachment purposes. So these are going to help the gametophyte to attach to some type of surface. What they won't be responsible for is actually absorbing nutrients that would then be transported throughout the rest of the plant. So we have a rhizoid, and then we also have what's called the protonemata, and that's going to be the little filamentous tissue that initially grows when that spore germinates. So we get our little plants, which are called gametophytes now. We have a female one and we're going to have a male one. And then within those, we will get the actual male gametangia, which is the antheridium. And then we're going to have the female one, which is going to be called the archegonium. The antheridia will produce sperm. These are going to be flagellated sperm. So that means that they're going to have little tails on them. Okay, so this is what we're talking about here. And then in the archegonium, we get one egg in each one of them. And so if there's water present, the sperm are going to be able to swim to the egg, and we would get fertilization take place. This means that our fertilization is going to be very dependent on water being present here. If we get fertilization, then that fertilized egg develops into the zygote. This is going to be kept within the archegonium. And now we have, if you look at this here, this is going to be a dependent sporophyte. Because that sporophyte is going to be dependent on the nutrition and the water that the archegonium can provide to it. So this is one of the things that helped the plants to now survive on dry land, because they were going to keep that sporophyte, the zygote, inside of this kind of parent tissue so that it could provide some nourishment and keep it from drying out. Through the process of mitosis, that zygote is going to grow into an embryo, and then eventually that does grow so that we get back to where we started, which is the sporophyte tissue, which is going to produce the sporangia. That's a typical life cycle for a moss. On this slide, we're seeing some representatives from the liverwort group, and this is going to be Hepatophyta. We have two general structures to liverworts. We have the thalloid ones, which have more flat leaves that will stay very low growing to the ground. And then we also have the leafy ones, which you see on the right-hand side of this slide. Now, these do grow close to the ground, and that's going to be something that is common with all of the bryophytes because they don't have that transport tissue that did later enable plants to gain quite a bit of size. So the layers of the leaves and the tissues are going to be very thin to enable the absorption and transfer of nutrients, and overall the plants are probably just going to be a couple of inches tall. On this slide, we do have an example of a moss. So this would be our bryophyta over here. Notice that we've got the brown sporophyte tissue, and then the real obvious part, which is the green leafy part, that is the gametophyte tissue. You've probably seen some mosses in the woods. Typically you see these growing on a rock perhaps, and you see just kind of a green carpet there, and you might see some very thin brown structure sticking up from that. So that would be part of this bryophyta group. On the right-hand side of this slide, we have our other group, and this is the hornworts. This is Antheroceraphita. These have a pretty distinctive structure to their sporophytes. So with these, we don't have that capsule on the top of the sporophytes. Instead, we just have sporophytes that look like a horn, and that's really where the name comes from here. So within here, we would have the spores develop. And then typically these, once they're developed, they do kind of split the whole way down, and then those spores can be released. If we just mention briefly the ecological and economic importance of mosses, they do have a lot of significant points for us. First of all, these are some of the first things to colonize barren land. And so if you have a piece of property where a fire has gone through and there is essentially nothing growing there, some of the first things that would begin to grow on that surface are going to be the bryophytes. If we have an area that just has very poor nutritional quality to it or very dry, the bryophytes can start to develop colonies in that area as well. And one of the reasons that they're able to do this is that they do form symbiosis relationships for nitrogen. So they can form symbiotic relationships with bacteria and fungi in the soil, and this will help them to get hold of available nitrogen. So plants themselves aren't capable of using nitrogen gas, which would be N2, but if they form these relationships, the fungi a lot of times or bacteria are able to capture nitrogen gas and then convert that into a form that's going to be usable for the plants. So they would be able to get that from that fungi or bacteria, and then they could use the nitrogen for purposes of making proteins and enzymes and other things that they might need to make. Another thing that they are really good for is for the production of peat. Peat, you've probably heard of peat moss. Maybe you've heard of sphagnum moss. This is, sphagnum moss is a particular moss, but this is partially decayed organic matter. So this partially decayed organic matter obviously would be good for just providing nutrients back to soil. And that's what we see happening over here in the the right-hand side of the slide. We see peat actually being harvested from a peat land, so a place where there is a lot of peat. And then this would be packaged into bags, which you could purchase at a lot of your home development stores or nursery stores. This can be used as what we call a soil conditioner. So it can provide organic matter back to the soil. It could also help the soil to hold some moisture a little bit better than perhaps it did before. It can also provide some porosity to the soil so that you can get a lot of good air movement. Now these areas that we call peat lands that have a lot of peat there or partially decayed organic matter, they tend to be very good at preservative qualities. So these are going to preserve a lot of things that fall into them. So there are cases where we have mummies that have been preserved in these areas. And one example is this Tallinn man here. He's a popular mummy, and he was discovered, he's actually considered to be 405 to 100 years BC. So quite ancient there. And so we do have a lot of good preservative qualities there. We can find a lot of good fossils in the peat lands. And then another thing that we want to point out is that peat is very good for a packing material. And as a good packing material, we're talking about for the purposes of shipping plants. Sometimes plants are sold bare root, and that means that there's not going to be a pot there, there's not going to be soil there when it's shipped, and that's because that then eliminates a lot of the weight that would be there. Well, what is done in those cases many times is that they will take sphagnum moss because it is so absorptive, and it can absorb a lot of water, and then they pack it around the roots, and then that keeps the roots moist while it's being shipped. So all of these things are things that the bryophytes are good for as far as humankind is concerned. So they're very good at colonizing barren land. They're very good at returning nutrition back to the soil, and they're also a very good source of packing materials for the nursery industry.